Through the first 9 games of the regular season, the Eagles have the same record as they had last year. So, which team is better, and in which ways is each team better or worse than the other? In today's video, I'm going to break down every specific stat, detail, and analysis there is to know about the Eagles. Now, before I get into the details, I think everybody felt more confident about the team last year than they do this year. This is 2 major reasons. One is that, especially the first half of the season, the Eagles were blowing everybody out. In their first 9 games, they had 5 wins by 2 possessions or more. If you compare it to this year, they only have 3 wins of 2 possessions or more. So, first off, even though it's the same record, the wins were just more convincing last year. The second major difference in the 2 years from a high level is that in 2022, the Eagles had a very unusually low amount of injuries. In fact, they even had all of their starters playing in the Super Bowl that were starters in Week 1, and that just never happens in the NFL. Injuries have taken their toll this year, though, especially on the defensive side of the ball, and even worse, especially defensive backs. And this has shown up in almost every game, with the slot corner position being severely weakened. And then the third broad reason why people would feel worse about the Eagles this year compared to last year is last year nobody expected anything from the Eagles. So they just completely surpassed expectations. Everyone was super happy. But on the other hand, this year, coming off a Super Bowl loss, now we have huge expectations. Now for the in-depth breakdowns. First, I'll go over the offense. Jalen Hurts, quite simply, has not looked as sharp as he did last year. Now, I do think he's on the rise. I think the past 3 games, he's looked great. And honestly, I think the past 3 games, he's looked about as good as he did last year. And if he keeps it up, I think he's going to win the MVP. But just comparing what's happened so far the first 9 games of the season, and then extrapolating it out the rest of the year, and then comparing it to last year. So Jalen only really played 14 games last year because of getting hurt and all of that. So he had 22 passing touchdowns and 6 interceptions, and then he had 13 rushing touchdowns, which is just insane to look at. And then compare it to this year. So far he has 15 touchdowns, 8 interceptions, 7 rushing touchdowns, and if you extrapolate this out through 14 games, he would have 23 touchdowns, 12 interceptions, and 11 rushing touchdowns. So really, the touchdowns are practically the same. It doesn't feel quite as good as it did last year, I think, because as I said earlier, the expectations just weren't there this year, and they are now. But his touchdowns are roughly on par with the prior year. His passing yards are up, and his rushing is down. So he's only rushed for 35 yards a game this year, but last year he rushed for 50 yards per game. I think we all know, especially Eagles fans, Jalen has been hurt this year. So his knee's hurt, he can't run as well. Maybe after the bye week he'll get better. And also, he's just been kind of scared to run the ball, which I respect from my quarterback, who I just want to stay healthy at this point, especially in the regular season. But his yards, his touchdowns, roughly the same. You know, they're in the same line. Where Jalen has completely fallen apart this year is interceptions. So this year, he is on pace for 15 interceptions and about 4 fumbles. Then, if you compare it to last year, Jalen Hurts was on pace. If he would have played the full 17 games, he would have thrown 7 or 8 interceptions. He ended up throwing 6, but, extrapolate it out, 7 or 8, and then he never lost a fumble, actually. So, in the regular season. We all know Super Bowl he did, but regular season he didn't. So he had, let's say, for the sake of comparing it as equals. 7 turnovers versus, almost 17 turnovers. This is huge. Like, it's over double, almost 2.5 times. And that's a huge part in why we don't feel as good. But it seems like Jalen's getting better, and he hasn't thrown any interceptions in the previous 2 games, and we'll see if we can make it 3 here on Monday. Then looking at the rushing game, the Eagles averaged about 150 yards per game rushing last year, and this year it's about 130. So there is one big reason for this, and it is that the Eagles were blowing teams out, if you can remember last year, especially in the second quarter, where it seemed like every single game the Eagles would go into the second quarter and they would score like 50 points in the second quarter. In the second half, they didn't even have to try, and they would just run the ball a lot. They can't do that this year. A lot of times they've been down going into halftime this year, and that, of course, this just leads to you running the ball less. And the Eagles have only averaged 4 yards per carry this year, and we're at 4.6 per carry last year. So even though against the Vikings it seemed like we had a pretty dominant run game, that has not lasted the rest of the year. And then looking at wide receivers, essentially, A.J. Brown is doing excellent, amazing, better than he's ever done before. And the rest of them, like Smith and Goddard, they're not doing as well. So we'll see what happens. I still think they're super talented, whenever Goddard gets back, even though that will probably be 4 weeks or so. But I don't think it's because of a reduction in talent. I just think AJ is stealing the ball too much. Not too much, because I think it works, but for the sake of stats, he's just stealing the ball from him. And then if you look at the points scored per game, the Eagles actually averaged about 28 points per game last year, and they averaged 28.1 per game this year. So that's actually the same. So that might surprise you too. So now for the defense. So last year, the Eagles defense almost set the record for most sacks ever with 70. And the Eagles defense caused a decent amount of turnovers. They caused 27 turnovers last year. This year, they're not having as many sacks. They're still doing good. They have 30 sacks so far, on pace for 57 sacks. Good season. Not historic like it was last season. They're giving up a few more yards than they did last season. They're giving up about 1 more point per game this year than they were last year. So that's a minor downside, but not that big of a deal. But the defense ends up making the big plays they did last year. The lack of sacks, and this year they've only had 11 turnovers so far this year, which puts the Eagles defense in 2023 on pace for about 21 turnovers, so 7 less than the prior year. So, no big plays from the defense. This will definitely hurt the team. And this also could be a fact from the Eagles offense not going up big, because that definitely did help the defense last year. But one area of more concern to me is the quality of corners that have been playing this year. It's just not the same as it was last year. Mainly slot corner, as I mentioned earlier, has been devastated by injury and has been really hurt. And then James Bradbury, especially as a corner, high-paid corner. He's old, maybe he's just too old, but he has not played very well this year, and they're picking, other teams are picking on him. And between him and the slot, we just seem like we give up as many passing yards as people want to take. So that's very concerning to me at this point. The bright side is the running defense is way better than it was last year. So Hargrave last year, defensive tackle, was very good, especially very good at sacking the quarterback, but he was not great at run defense. So Jalen Carter and Jordan Davis this year actually are better at run defense than we were last year. So our stout defensive line last year, there was an area of weakness. Even in the Super Bowl, they gave up a decent amount of rushing yards. This year, the defense does not give up rushing yards to anybody. So that is one upside of the defense. And then the third phase of the game, something that all Eagles love to complain about over the past year, the punter. So last year, the punter was bad, like very bad. This year, we started off with the same punter. However, we changed after a few weeks, and the new guy has actually been, I would say, average, which is a big improvement from terrible. So that's another bright side. But anyways, a bit of a recap of the Eagles in 2023 versus 2022. Are they better? I don't think so. I think they're slightly worse in several areas, but I think their passing offense could be a little better. I think their rush defense is definitely better. But they're not blowing teams out like they were last year, and that's a little concerning that they have to fight really hard for every win. This could be an upside that at the end of the year they know how to win close games, or maybe one time in the playoffs they just can't come back. I could see either way. I think they are very slightly worse than last year. But I think last year was an absolutely excellent team. I think the 2023 team this year can still easily win the Super Bowl. I wouldn't be surprised at all. And if I had to pick a team, I'd pick the Eagles, especially to make it to the Super Bowl out of the NFC. I'd definitely pick the Eagles. But if I had to pick who would win, I'd still probably pick the Eagles. So, while people in Philly, some might be concerned, some might think the team's excellent, who knows. But I think the team is great this year. I know I've sounded a little negative, but I'm comparing them to one of the best teams in a long time. And I think they're going to win the Super Bowl. So, thanks for watching my video. If you have any thoughts, any comments, leave a comment. If you would like to see more, subscribe and leave a like. Bye.